Hi everyone, I'm Gary Knoll. I'd like to welcome you back to part 2 of our continuing exploration on health and nutrition issues. We take our cameras around the world. We take it to where the information is most relevant and most essential for our well-being. We've all been terrorized into believing we're all equally susceptible to this scourge called AIDS. That HIV is the cause, that the antibody test determines who has it. Once you have it, you must take the drugs or you're going to die. Even taking the drugs, you'll probably still die. Well, what if everything we were told about AIDS were wrong? That's what we're exploring. I've taken my camera around the world to film the dissidents, the people you won't see on the major media, who won't be on the cover of Time magazine as Man of the Year. No, theirs is a different story because they believe we should deconstruct the entire myth of AIDS. We're going to give them a forum. Join us today as we explore in our continuing series, AIDS: A Second Opinion.
The problem with the Western blot, and there are many, is not only that it is susceptible to the same flaws that cause cross reactions on the ELISA, but that is not reproducible and it's not standardized. It is possible to test positive or negative on the same Western blot done on the same blood specimen, depending on what test kit you use, whether it's from a different manufacturer, what day of the week you go in, what lab you go to, or even what country you live in.
Now, the Western blot is considered the more specific of the two tests because it uses 10 proteins to detect antibodies, whereas the ELISAs conventionally use 2 or 3. Western blot uses 10. You can get a positive Western blot in Africa that would not be considered positive in Australia. You can get a positive, by official, this is official guidelines, you can get a positive Western blot in Britain that is far more specific than a positive Western blot for the largest gay men's study, HIV and AIDS, the MAX study in America. In the MAX study in America, on the Western blot, which American viewers will know is essential to HIV positive diagnosis, you require only one strong antibody band out of a possible 10 in order to be called positive. In Britain, that is insufficient. So we're in a situation where even on the most specific test, it matters what country you got tested in. So is this absurd?
I have a chart here that will show you that one of the best ways to change from positive to negative is simply to change your residence to a different country. This was published in Continuum magazine from London. It was made up by Val Turner, a scientist in Australia who's done a lot of work on HIV antibody tests. And he has pointed out that there are different criteria for reading these tests. And each one of these columns shows the different criteria from different countries or places. Now, as you can see, going from one column to the next, there are different criteria. Without looking real closely, you can see it's pretty obvious. In Africa, all you need is 2 of these bands to be positive. In Australia, you need 4. In the United States, we have 5 different sets of criteria for reading Western blots, and they are all totally different. So if you go to a lab that uses the American Red Cross criteria, you may be positive. And if you go to a lab that uses the FDA criteria, you may be negative. And if you go to a lab that uses the CDC criteria, you will more likely be positive there because they use much more lax criteria. Now, this is totally ridiculous. How can you say that somebody is infected with HIV or not, depending on whether they live in the United States or in Australia? It's totally absurd.
We get a lot of cross-reacting. For instance, if you've recently had a flu jab, you're told not to have an antibody test because you might come up positive. 41% of patients with multiple sclerosis in one study tested positive for HIV. 12% of people with generalized warts. If you live in an area where tuberculosis or leprosy or malaria are endemic, you could come up positive for HIV even though you don't have HIV. So there's so many different variables as to what might give a positive reading. I don't believe that any test has ever yet given absolutely specific HIV antibody results or reactions.
What are the different antigens and antibodies and conditions will cause a false positive reading?
Well, like I said, we have hepatitis B and we have herpes simplex, which is a very common condition. There must be millions of people in the United States infected with that. And flu, or a flu vaccination will do it, and even the common cold. Now, this would be a very rare chance that that would happen, but it is a possibility. And in countries like Africa, where it's supposed to be riddled with AIDS, or in Southeast Asia or India, where we are supposed to have these new up-and-coming heterosexual AIDS epidemics, what's really happening there is that there are such huge amounts of endemic tuberculosis and malaria and hepatitis B and all of those things cross-react on the tests, that's what's happening. When people are tested in those regions, it is very easy for a cross-reaction to take place. And there are other things such as alcoholism, alcoholic hepatitis, the connective tissue disorders such as lupus or mixed connective tissue disorder, or rheumatoid arthritis, and there are a lot of people that have that. You know, the methods of the viral load papers and studies, the methods are wrong. They're shoddy science. They don't make sense. They're based on PCR, which isn't really good for HIV, and they just don't do the right calculations. Plus, even if they did actually find millions of viruses like they claim to have found, what they're claiming to have found is not the latent viruses that have infected the cell, but free virus, which is outside the cell. Now, the old standard mainstream AIDS research says that free virus, which is outside the cell, is not infectious, because when it is outside the cell, the envelope of the virus is very fragile and it usually will fall off. So in order for one cell to infect another with its HIV, the cells have got to butt up against each other. And if the virus is just free and it's out floating around in the bloodstream, it's probably lost its envelope. And the envelope is a crucial part of the infectivity process. Without the envelope, it can't infect because it can't bind on to the little site, the receptor site where it's supposed to bind itself.
The general public doesn't understand the idea of a gold standard here. Neither do doctors, physicians. So, I mean, you know, you just pull the average physician away from his convention someplace in Cincinnati or something and sit down and have dinner with him and talk to him about this kind of a situation and see how much he really knows. Like, does he know what a Western does? Does he know what a Western blot actually does? I mean, how is it different from this ELISA test? Does he understand how an ELISA test is operated? Does he understand anything about the statistics associated with the times when they've been tried? No, he doesn't. And he doesn't give a damn either. What he knows about is that when he has a patient, he charges them a certain amount of money for every treatment that he does, for every little prescription that he writes, and he likes to have a lot of patients. And the county health department also knows that due to the Ryan-White Act, for every single person who is diagnosed as having AIDS in the county, $2,500 a year from the federal government. So the county health department is actually pressuring doctors by their little subtle ways. They're not coming over and beating them, but don't miss an AIDS case. You report it to us. If it's a positive test on the HIV, you report it to us because it's $2,500 in our pocket every year.
I'm suggesting specifically, Professor Stewart, is that if JAMA, Nature, the British Medical Journal, the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, the 5 major medical publications in the world, will not allow dissident views on the cause or treatment of AIDS or any information around it, How then are you going to encourage a dialogue that could challenge the orthodox?
A good question. You've mentioned the big five. You've mentioned Science, Nature, the New England Journal, the Lancet, and the British Medical Journal. Now, with the possible exception of the Lancet, all of these have refused to publish views which doubt the existing hypothesis about AIDS. And the two main aspects of the hypothesis are that AIDS is caused exclusively and finally by HIV, and secondly, that this is universally infectious and will cause a pandemic by heterosexual transmission in the general population. Those are the two prime tenets of the existing hypothesis, which is held by the consensus. Now, the Lancet has published some stuff, mainly by me, in the form of letters, which cast doubt on those two essential pillars of the hypothesis. They haven't published much else, and the other journals have published nothing at all. They've been asked to do so again and again by myself and others, but they will not publish.
How much censorship has there been in the gay press concerning looking at all issues and all arguments from all sides, fairly and objectively?
The censorship in the gay press is a tragedy, a disgrace. It's been almost complete. There are people in this city who work quite hard to try and create the space in which a proper discussion can be had.
The consensus controls the thinking, the funds, the grants, the publicity, and the policy.
The media has just gone along with the government party line, and it's partly their fault and it's partly the government's, because I know that any journalist who dares speak against what the government says is cut off, and the government won't give them the story or the information they need to write. So I blame both the government and the media.
Do you feel scientists have also allowed themselves to be co-opted because if they challenged, they wouldn't get any funding?
Yes, scientists who speak up against the HIV theory are cut off almost immediately. This happened to Peter Duesberg. He has no funding when he used to be able to get any grant he wanted. And one kind of hears to the back door of various scientists who agree with him, and they come to him in private and say, "Don't say my name, but I agree with you, and I can never say that because I know I'll lose my grant if I do."
My funding, for example, from the National Institute of Health will not be renewed as of this year, and I may be out of business then. Also, my colleagues have essentially excommunicated me. I'm not invited to meetings, or hardly ever to meetings anymore, not ever to one on AIDS. I'm not allowed to publish in the same journals anymore as I used to. Even as a member of the National Academy, I cannot publish in the National Academy my views that drugs may be the cause of AIDS. And I have plenty of evidence to support it, to document my claim, which might be very relevant to the health of millions of Americans and people on this planet. Yet I'm censored because I'm essentially considered to be an outcast or an odd man or somebody who has controversial views.
That the current generation have too much to lose of orthodoxy, of journalists. They've invested their lives in trying to be helpful to the AIDS debate. They think that their journalism is helping. In actual fact, it's based on a false premise. Now, they're not going to backtrack, neither the journalists nor the scientists. Nobody's going to backtrack. There's too much to lose.
By fair and objective, they seem to think all they have to do is represent the orthodox view. That to represent or to mention that there is any kind of argument, either they cover it with ridicule or they don't even mention it at all, because they seem to think that would mislead the public, give them a false impression, might make them more relaxed about having safe sex, etc., or in other words, not to have safe sex. And so they just don't want to know about the alternative view. As far as they're concerned, it's anathema, it shouldn't ever be mentioned. If the great and the good say this is so, it must be so because everybody says so. But so therefore there's bound to be some form of censorship, and not out of any sort of moral thing, but just I think out of fear.
And whenever I or anyone else raises the argument that we should start looking at the alternative views, we're immediately told that we're being highly irresponsible, that we're encouraging the gay community into things like unsafe sex, and we're being completely and utterly disregarding the anxieties of people who have HIV and AIDS, because we're creating doubts and anxieties that they don't need. And this is quite wrong, because as a journalist, I believe in totally open debate in whatever the area should be.
I think it's very important that people really educate themselves and take nothing for granted. Are you really HIV positive at all? I'm holding up a very prestigious scientific journal, Biotechnology. In June '93, they look at the issue. Is testing positive on a Western blot test proof of infection? They come to the conclusion it's not.
As I understand it, there is not a single HIV, so-called HIV antibody test which can reliably prove the presence of a virus in a person. And that's good news. It means that anybody who's been told that they're HIV positive cannot rely on that piece of information, and ought to be thinking about living long and living well, not about preparing for death.
They've expanded the list of diseases, they've expanded the criteria for diagnosis, and they've essentially rewritten the rules, because if they had kept the definition of AIDS as it originally was, and to the point where it actually made sense that it might be an infectious syndrome, it would have ended by now. As John Lauritsen has said, the AIDS epidemic, if you keep the definition constant, peaked in 1988 and it's over. But because you have this vast infrastructure that needs new cases, that needs to justify itself to stay in business, then you have this constant redefinition, constant reclassification, constant rewriting the rules, all so you can continue with the idea that there is an AIDS epidemic and we need to put billions of dollars into it every year.
So the latest change was in 1993, and that brought in 3 diseases which really have nothing to do with AIDS, one of them being pulmonary tuberculosis, which now means that anybody with TB can have AIDS. And you ought to know too that TB all by itself causes a depletion of T cells, and when you have TB it can look exactly like you have AIDS, but you don't, you have TB. They are virtually indistinguishable. And another thing the new definition brought in was cervical cancer. I don't see how anybody could relate this to a retrovirus. It was purely a political move to make sure that women got more health benefits. It has nothing to do with who has AIDS and who doesn't. And then the most important thing was that they said if you are HIV positive and your T cell count is 200 or less, you have AIDS. And that means that people who have got nothing wrong with them whatsoever except a low T cell count and a positive antibody test can now be classified as having AIDS.
It's a tangled web of madness by calling all those things AIDS, by just making it more and more and more complicated to figure out what causes what. See, it's like, that's not the way science works. It's a real bizarre thing to have 100,000 people being paid to do something that strange, to take a whole bunch of diseases, to lump them all into this one big thing. This great, I mean, pretty soon there won't be anything that's not AIDS if they keep going at the rate they're going. You say, well, let's see what will happen in 100 years. How many diseases will be on that list?
I think the problem is that the establishment realizes that they don't know where they're going. They're going down a particular path which is leading them nowhere because they're not solving the problems. And all the time the public are saying, where is the magic cure? We've spent millions in this direction. What's happening? No results. And the establishment themselves obviously realize that they've got to put on a brave, confident face. So anyone that attempts to challenge where they're going will get flattened because they're really frightened of showing that the cracks in what they're doing. They're petrified, I think, of allowing too much of a debate because it will expose them as floundering around, not knowing where they're going.
One of the most respected voices in science, leading virologist Dr. Stefan Lanka, maintains that HIV isolation meets none of the scientific standards required for proof of its existence. Therefore, there has been no HIV viral identification.
Nowadays, they say the application of those genetic testing, cloning, it means amplification of isolated genetic materials and detection of stretches of it with the PCR techniques is proof of the existence of viruses, just ignoring all history of virology. That first, of course, if you say you have a virus, you have to isolate it to show the whole particle, to show its proteins by direct techniques, to show its genetic material, etc.
PCR came along right about the same time that HIV did. And it was at CETUS that people started looking with PCR for HIV. That was the only way to see it, except for culture, which was a long, protracted procedure, which a lot of times didn't turn up the results there weren't very good either.
Can be contaminated.
Oh, the cultures, the whole method, that cell biology is a bunch of magic half the time. And those culture, you know, the people that say they can do quantitative estimations of HIV from cultures are just, they're fooling themselves.
If they take only patient material from a patient, they never will succeed in viral isolation. They may detect a certain protein of a given size saying, well, this is part of HIV. They will find stretches of genetic material amplified with PCR saying, well, this is part of HIV. And this is absolutely wrong.
I've seen virus-like particles, but you can make virus-like particles which are identical to HIV come out of cell lines which are not infected with any virus at all. And exactly the same virus-like particles start to appear. Of course, you have to spray it with a mitogenic drug first. In fact, if you have a cell line which is infected with so-called HIV, it sits there and it does nothing until you spray it with a mitogenic drug.
It's silly to hear people saying, you don't believe that HIV causes AIDS? You don't believe that? I mean, it's just a word, but it's a very, very important distinction. I think that you know, that's why, it's become a very emotional kind of thing, because people actually, they get personally committed to what really is a body of evidence that can be analyzed, you know, by lots of people, and at this point there's so much of it out there, nobody can really analyze it, all of it, but nobody can write a review of it that says HIV causes AIDS because of this. You know, if a postdoc were to write a review of their literature that showed without much doubt that HIV was the cause of AIDS, that guy would be famous. Now there's 100,000 guys out there who had the opportunity. 10 years has passed. We've been waiting for this star postdoctoral fellow to distinguish himself forever and get a lifelong grant from Tony Fauci, but he hasn't shown up. No one has bothered to write a definitive review. Any journal would take it. That right there proves that HIV does not cause AIDS.
This is a case of self-deception, at least, and deception in case of all other scientists who were supplied by cloned genetic stretches said to represent parts of the HIV genome. Working with this and believing that the original isolation has been performed in a proper way.
If HIV by itself does not cause these 29 separate conditions we call AIDS, then what would be the most reasonable cause of all these conditions?
It's as if they had found a cause before anybody had even noticed an effect. Adult T-cell leukemia wasn't known to medicine until 1975, 5 years after Tayman and his colleagues discovered the enzyme, which we call today reverse transcriptase, and established the phenomenon of reverse transcription. So 5 years later, they discover a disease which seems to fit and seems to have a correlation with this HTLV1 virus. But to find the potential cause of a disease 5 years before anybody's even noticed the disease is a bit like saying that Robert Koch could discover the cause of tuberculosis 5 years before anybody had even noticed tuberculosis. And then, of course, AIDS was subsequently cooked up in 1981-82 to explain why certain groups of people were ill. But nobody seemed to ask the one simple question. Are we absolutely sure that all these so-called high-risk groups of people would have been perfectly well without HIV? And the answer to that has to be no.
Over the years, it became clear, despite continued protestations to the contrary, that AIDS was not spreading outside the original risk groups. It was not spreading in the way that one would be expected if this were a sexually transmitted disease and an infectious disease. With that, you would indeed find an equal distribution between the sexes as time went on, but it hasn't been like that in the countries most affected by AIDS.
The whole business of infection is wrong. In Haiti, they told me they'd followed 780 couples over 8 years. To their amazement, one couple was positive and one negative, I hasten to add. 750, 8 years? Do you know how many became both positive, concurrent, I think it's called? 36. They couldn't work it out. Why would that be?
Prostitute women don't have higher rates of HIV or AIDS than anybody else. And in fact, any research that has been done has also shown a number of other things that indicate that prostitute women are taking very good care of their health and the health of clients and the community in general, and have traditionally always used condoms. We're insisting on condoms long before the AIDS industry promoted them as the cure for AIDS.
People are being told right off the bat that HIV will kill them. It will eventually cause AIDS, and you will eventually die in almost 100% of the cases. They are not told, and I was never told in 25 years of being sexually active, that hepatitis, that gonorrhea, that syphilis would kill me, that recreational drugs would kill me, that antibiotics would kill me. I was told if I get syphilis, if I get gonorrhea, I take a drug and I get rid of them. And then I go right back out to having sex, getting more syphilis, more gonorrhea, more antibiotics, and get rid of them.
Thank you very much for watching. I'm Gary Null, back next week, continuing with this special series on AIDS: A Second Opinion.